You have probably heard about the idea of the Aryan race, blue eyes, blonde hair, pale skinned Europeans. This myth is a core foundation of Nazi ideology to promote the idea of a master race in order to justify the idea that Germany is the natural leader of this world and the races they deem inferior are meant to be subjugated. But how much of this is really true? In this video, I'll be diving into this myth and explain why it was a fabrication of history in order to push an ideology rather than being grounded in the truth. The term Aryan originally refers to the people of ancient Iran in India. It was during the 19th century when European scholars noticed linguistic and cultural links between ancient Iranian people and some European groups. They traced that these two people share a common origin from Central Asia. Some migrated south, becoming the ancestors of modern-day Iranians and Indians. The others went north, becoming the ancestors of modern-day Europeans. And from there, they co-opted the term Aryan and used it to claim that Europeans were the original and superior Aryans. This was a time where racial pseudoscience and nationalism were rising in Europe, and they needed to justify colonialism as a civilizing mission, so this was a perfect story for them to lean into to prove that their domination is natural. Hitler and the Nazis hijacked this myth to build an entire ideology around the superiority of the Aryan race. They imagined the original Aryans as having blue eyes, blonde hair, to argue that they are the pure descendants of them, while the actual Aryans are supposedly decadent Aryans due to mixing with other so-called inferior races. Even though in reality, the original Aryans likely had darker hair and skin, while blonde hair and blue eyes are mutations that occurred later in Europe. They claim the achievements of people they don't actually have anything to do with because they believe they're the pure descendants and deny the actual people living there as being the real descendants. This is what allowed them to claim Rome, Greece, Persia, India, and even Egypt as Aryan achievements, while dismissing the actual people living there as decadent due to mixing. Even though historically they were actually tribal people who were considered barbarians by the Romans. Instead, they claimed that they are actually the ones who built these great civilizations before becoming decadent, while the ones up north stayed pure to hide their actual not-so-great history. They wanted to prove that there's a timeless master race and twisted history to push that agenda. They essentially said, everything great was built by us, and everything bad was because of you. A lot of people like to mock Afrocentrists for claiming Egypt despite them mainly being descendants from West Africans, but they don't mention the Nazis even though they were literally the first ones to claim achievements from other groups who they claim look more like them despite them being all the way up in Northern Europe. Their concept of a perfect Aryan specimen was also super exclusionary and contradictory, excluding Slavs for being supposedly mixed with Asiatic blood, and Southern Europeans for being mixed with North Africans and Semitic blood, and Jews for their Semitic roots, even though these groups can look identical to Germans. How exactly is someone with blue eyes, blonde hair of Jewish ancestry less pure Aryan than a dark-haired German by their standards? And they ignored how even Northern Europe isn't even as pure as they think because even they experienced mixing with other groups, including the Slavs, which they despise due to migration over time. The idea of whiteness has always been shifting. Before, the Nazis thought only Northern Europeans were pure and others were mixed with non-European blood. Yet nowadays, they're seen as fully white. Somehow everyone in Europe is considered 100% white, despite some of them having mixed blood, whereas someone outside of Europe can look very white, yet isn't usually considered white just because they happen to be born outside of the continent. The concept of a pan-European identity is more of a modern construct to unite people in Europe against people outside of it, rather than being logically consistent. Historically, they fought each other all the time rather than thinking they were of one group. The blatant hypocrisy in allying with the Japanese and calling them honorary Aryans while calling Slavs subhumans because they supposedly have Asiatic Mongol blood. Only because they wanted to take over Russian land for the German Reich, which is why they had to argue Slavs were less European, while the Japanese and Italians are allies, so they were exempt. What's ironic is that many Germans didn't even have blonde hair or blue eyes, yet they were still put at the top of the hierarchy because they were still supposedly spiritually Aryan, and Germany is the soul of Aryan greatness, while Nordics, despite being the ideal specimen to them, is still only considered secondary to Germans. It allowed them to preach about an Aryan brotherhood, while still saying that they are little brothers who have to follow German lead. Why does that sound similar to someone nowadays? Their view is extremely West-centric. To them, anything that is outside of their Aryan framework is considered irrelevant, ignoring the Middle East has mathematics, and China had gunpowder, paper, and the compass, and they were advanced way before Northern Europe. They were quick to dismiss the Japanese as imitators, using their standards of innovation as proof of superiority, but they ignore how other regions have their own strengths, like how China is able to survive and thrive for thousands of years as a continuous empire and still till this day, something no other Western civilization can really claim. In the end, they lost to the people they deem inferior, both the Slavs, who they called subhumans, and the USA, which they called a mongrel nation, and it's not too surprising considering their ideology was full of contradictions to begin with. Yet till this day, edgelords still love to parrot the idea of an Aryan race, ignoring how the guy who yelled the loudest about the idea of a master race actually lost the most catastrophically. Nowadays, with powers like China rising again, it really shows how fragile the idea of their imagined pure master race is. Rome didn't collapse because of race mixing. If it did, China should have collapsed too long ago, because China is certainly not pure Han, but it still thrives till this day. But of course, the Nazis would ignore everything that contradicts their framework. Even the USA isn't like their motto, because while it's a Western global superpower, it's made up of talents from all over the world, nothing like their supposed racially pure utopian which collapsed in 12 years. In conclusion, the idea of a master race promoted by the Nazis is a scam. This concept was never true to begin with, and history proves it. Empires rise and fall all the time. There's no sense of racial destiny here. Even if some groups supposedly have higher IQs on average, that doesn't automatically translate to dominance. Other factors like geography, politics, culture matter a lot too. If it was about race, Northern Europe should have been thriving along with the Romans, but it was actually tribal and behind in comparison. The Romans were civilized and the Northern Europeans were considered barbarians, until the Nazis flip it into Germans are civilized and Italians are decadent. That's it for the video. Thanks for watching.